As Tom said, my name is Justin Litke. I teach here at Catholic University in the Department of Politics. And we are so happy that you guys are with us today here at Catholic U on this important topic. We've got an interesting panel today. I'll say more when we've been edified by the two papers, but I'm going to try to get us talking a little bit, maybe even arguing a little bit. That's what I'm hoping to do. But so you know who you're arguing with. We are so pleased to have Dr. Thomas Varacalli and Dr. Bracy Bersnak here with us today. Dr. Varacalli actually teaches at an institution I'm very familiar with at Belmont Abbey College, where he is, get this, the dean of the Honors College. So you really have to listen to what he has to say because he's a dean. Maybe. But we're certainly happy to have him. Did his graduate schooling at LSU and is here with us today doing great work down in North Carolina. Doing equally great work out in Front Royal is Bracy Bersnak, who is the professor and chairman of the Department of Political Science and Economics at Christendom College, but who most importantly got his PhD at the Catholic University of America. But we're happy to have him back here too. We'll just go in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Dr. Bersnak. He's going to present his paper called Orestes Brownson and the Separation of Church and State. And then we'll just follow right in with Dr. Varacalli on the harmonious relationship between the spiritual and the temporal power. So join me in welcoming Dr. Bracy Bersnak.
Thank you, Justin. And I want to thank Tom and the folks here at Seaway for organizing this conference. I've been an admirer of Brownson for a long time, and most years I go to the Notre Dame Ethics and Culture Center conference, and I always go to the crypt underneath the basilica to pray for him. And so it's nice to be able to honor him on the 150th anniversary of his death. As the most prominent American Catholic thinker of his time, Brownson often felt the need to explain to his fellow countrymen what contemporary popes meant when they condemned the separation of church and state. To many Protestants, the Pope's condemnations showed that Catholicism was incompatible with American democracy. Brownson did not condemn institutional interrelations between church and state in Europe on principle, but he did not think that it was likely or expedient for them to last much longer. Instead, he thought American institutional arrangements on church and state would become more widespread and were in any case more beneficial to the church in modern times. That position earned him criticism from defenders of the popes who questioned his orthodoxy. And what I want to consider in this short paper, just general principles of the relationship between the spiritual and temporal powers, according to Brownson, and then how he viewed concrete arrangements in France and America and their implications. Brownson thought that it was inapt to speak of church and state as separate because the spiritual and temporal realms inevitably overlap. In his words, the two orders are distinguishable but not separable. The temporal is never without the spiritual, any more than the creature is without the creator. Therefore, it is impossible in practice to draw a line of demarcation between them so that the one shall never overlap with the other. That's Brownson. The spiritual power comes from God and is exercised by the Pope as head of the Church. The Church is a spiritual kingdom, complete and self-sufficient, providing her own body of law for herself, and is the authoritative interpreter of divine and natural law. The temporal power also comes from God. It is given by God to the people or the nation according to nature, who then translate it to a specific ruler or rulers. Proclaiming the separation or independence of the temporal order from the spiritual authority of the Church, Brownson called political atheism, because it meant proclaiming independence from God. It is a permanent temptation of the temporal power. If the state purports to be the definitive interpreter of the natural law, then it declares independence from the Church. But it also implicitly asserts the authority to interpret divine law, too, because they have the same source in God. Brownson pointed out that Thomas Hobbes understood this connection between natural and divine law. That was why Hobbes claimed that the sovereign was the definitive interpreter of positive law, natural law, and the divine law. The result was, again, political atheism, because the sovereign would refuse to recognize any moral authority independent of, much less above, themselves. Brownson said the spiritual power is higher than the temporal power because its object, God, is higher than the this-worldly object of temporal power. The temporal power is therefore subordinate to the spiritual power and ordered to it. The state has no inherent competence in spiritual matters. If the state acts to uphold the interests of the church or defend her, it may only do so at the behest of the church. When temporal affairs touch upon spiritual matters, the popes have an indirect power over them. The pope has the authority to judge the morality of acts of private individuals and public officials. His spiritual power extends, in exceptional cases, to releasing citizens from oaths of loyalty, effectively deposing temporal rulers when necessary for some spiritual good. Brownson acknowledged, however, that the practical effectiveness of this authority depended on those subject to it actually obeying it. Beyond these general principles, Brownson believed that concrete arrangements concerning the relations between church and state were almost wholly a matter of historical contingency. The arrangements of a given time period, such as medieval Christendom, were not universally valid. Brownson did not condemn the close relations between the church and kings in the Middle Ages, but he believed that the church's exercise of civil authority and her civilizing mission in medieval Europe was temporary and accidental rather than providentially ordained. Even the temporal sovereignty of the popes over the papal states was expedient, but not necessarily indispensable. The popes had managed for 700 years before acquiring the papal states. They might do so again. Though the conquest of the papal states by Piedmont Sardinia was unjust, Brownson hoped the popes might find themselves relieved of a distracting burden. New conditions in Europe and America seemed to call for new arrangements. Separation between church and state meant two different things in Europe and America. In Europe, Brownson said separation meant the moral and political independence of the temporal order from the spiritual. That was the sense in which Pius IX had condemned separation of church and state in the Syllabus of Errors. He observed that the moral independence of the temporal from the spiritual could, paradoxically, go hand in hand with the institutional dependence of the spiritual power on the temporal in a place like France, where relations between church and state were governed by the Concordat made by Napoleon I with Pope Pius VII in 1801. The French government had the right to nominate bishops, required all clergy to swear an oath of loyalty to the Constitution, and paid clerical salaries. The following year, Napoleon unilaterally added a series of so-called organic articles to the Concordat, asserting greater power over the church. The organic articles required government permission for papal documents to be published in France, regulated the internal governance of the church, and gave parties unsatisfied by the decisions of ecclesiastical courts the right to appeal to civil courts. Later, Napoleon adopted legislation from the reign of Louis XIV enacting the Gallican Articles. The Gallican Articles asserted that the Pope's authority was purely spiritual and did not extend to temporal matters, even indirectly. All of this legislation remained in force until the 1905 Law of Separation of Church and State. Under Napoleon III, the Ministry of Worship forbade the Syllabus of Errors from being read from French pulpits because it condemned the principles of Gallicanism. While Napoleon III gave considerable material support to the church, Brownson observed that, again in his words, he committed the usual mistake of secular sovereigns, that of insisting on keeping the control of the ecclesiastical administration in their respective dominions, each in his own hands, and of using the church to control his subjects, but of allowing her no authority over himself. Brownson worried that Napoleon's Catholic defenders in France harmed the Church by making her too closely identified with a set of political arrangements that were less and less viable. But he also warned against Catholic liberals making the Church a servant of popular government. The liberals called for a free church and a free state, but that also left the Church's freedom dependent on the state. By making the Church an instrument of a particular regime, they would undermine institutional separation and reinforce moral separation. In America, by contrast, separation of church and state meant institutional independence. The state did not profess the true religion or expressly recognize the rights of the church. It did, however, recognize that citizens are free and equal and have a right to religious liberty. Moreover, the right to religious liberty is recognized as coming from God rather than being granted by the state. Insofar as American citizens exercise their right to be practicing Catholics, the state recognizes the rights of the institutional church. When Americans spoke of the Constitution as being subject to the higher law, Brownson argued this showed they believed that it was subject to the spiritual order. In that sense, the temporal and the spiritual were united in America, not separated. Brownson did not say that it is wrong to recognize the church in law, but he believed such legislation to be primitive, outdated, and not lowercase c Catholic, meaning that it could not be universal. While he thought Concordats recognizing the church might be suitable for monarchies, he was concerned that they tended to put constraints on the church instead of guaranteeing her liberty. The very need for Concordats was not a symptom of unity between church and state, but of disunion. In republics, by contrast, in his words, the true religion is in the heart of the state as its informing principle and real interior life. The external establishment, by legal enactment of the church, would afford her no additional protection, add nothing to her power and efficacy, and effect nothing for faith or piety. That's Brownson. The way for the church to shape politics in the future would be by working through the consciences of the faithful, not through legal enactments. Brownson lamented that, unfortunately, however, too many Catholic politicians in America were practical Gallicans, who said that their religion had no bearing whatsoever on their politics. The church did not receive legal recognition or material support from the government in the U.S., but she could incorporate herself in law like any other church, and her rights were protected. Contrary to arrangements in France, American civil courts did not claim jurisdiction over canon law. The Pope was free to choose bishops as he saw fit, and they were free to communicate with him. The church had greater freedom to teach, govern, and worship as she saw fit. Institutional separation of church and state facilitates the moral union of church and state, according to Brownson, because it prevents the state from asserting control over the church. If the state makes the church institutionally dependent on it, rulers will have the conceit that the temporal is superior to the spiritual, and they are not subject to the moral authority of the popes. In 19th century France, legal recognition and material support came with considerable interference in the internal life of the church. In the U.S., the hands-off approach of the law facilitated the flourishing of the church. Separation properly understood allows the temporal and the spiritual powers to play their proper roles, facilitating a harmonious inner union between them on the basis of their order and a proper hierarchy of ends. For Brownson, religious liberty is the basis of political liberty, because the exercise of political liberty depends on a spiritual freedom that comes from religious belief and practice. To be effective, the spiritual power has to be embodied in a concrete, practically effective institution, namely the church. He rightly observed that there can be no external alliance between religion and liberty unless they are two separate and mutually independent forces or powers. We forget his lesson at our peril.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Tom, for organizing this lovely conference. I want to thank all of you for staying, and I want to thank my 4 Belmont Abbey students for being in the audience too. My paper is going to address how Brownson is able to integrate this two swords doctrine with the compatibility of the United States. So the two swords doctrine, as it was traditionally understood, as Dr. Bersnak brought out, was that there is a spiritual power and a temporal power, and that the spiritual power is greater than the temporal power, but they have distinct spheres. In his pivotal essay, Authority and Liberty, Brownson articulates in some vocabulary unique to him the two swords doctrine. He writes, quote, that the church and the state as administrators are distinct bodies, but they are not, as some modern politicians would persuade us, two coordinate and mutually independent authorities, end quote. How can they be distinct bodies but have similar authority? Brownson affirms that all authority comes from God. Both supernatural revelatory law and natural law derive from God, and to God they are one, but to human beings they are separate. The church's power comes directly from God under supernatural and revealed law. Now, the church has authority from God to enforce both supernatural and natural law, but only the church has jurisdiction over revelation. The state does not. The state is subject to natural law. It doesn't create natural law. It must assent to its principles through natural reason. If a state deviates from nature and coerces its members to deviate from nature, then the state is tyrannical. The church, as both the interpreter of revelation and natural law, can serve as a check against the state when it acts in a tyrannical manner. Hence the opportunity for some significant jurisdictional tension between the spiritual and the temporal power. If there is ever a disagreement between the church and the state on natural law, the church trumps the state. Brownson writes, quote, the church is, under God, the supreme judge of both laws, which for her are but one law, and hence she takes cognizance in her tribunals of the breaches of the natural law as well as of the revealed, but has the right to take cognizance of its breaches by nations, as well as its breaches by individuals, by the prince, as well as by the subject, for it is a supreme law for both. The state is therefore only an inferior court, bound to receive the law for the Supreme Court and liable to have its decisions reversed on appeal, end quote. It is here where we see the possibility of the medieval origins of the two swords doctrine conflicting with the modernity of the United States. The United States, with the possible exception of treaties, does not accept the authority of ultramontane power to reverse its laws, or in the words of Brownson, have its decisions reversed on appeal. What is supposed to happen when the United States passes a law contrary to revelation? So first, I think it is important to note that Brownson is very careful with his language. The church first is to, quote, to take cognizance of its breaches. The church does not have a mandate from God to ensure that justice is being administered through the faithful application of revelatory laws and natural law. Taking cognizance does not mean immediate action. It implies some sort of prudential deliberation about how the church is supposed to respond. The church, moreover, can take cognizance of the abuses of nations, but also of individuals and rulers. Therefore, it may indeed be possible for the church to instruct individuals and even rulers privately, outside the public square. Individuals can be reprimanded through a variety of measures, the most extreme of which is excommunication, without having to enter into open political waters. Even rulers can be reprimanded through non-political measures, such as the denial of communion. Yet these possibilities I present do not take away from the significant overarching Protestant fear that the Pope and/or the bishops would actively infringe upon the sovereignty of the United States. As far as I can tell, Brownson does not explicitly deny the possibility of the indirect power of the papacy, but he doesn't seem to significantly advocate for it either. Instead, his strategy is to show that a direct papal assault on obedience to the regime is immensely unlikely for Americans. In his essay, Civil and Religious Toleration, Brownson makes an important distinction between political and religious toleration, since both are often confused with each other. Political toleration is the permission given by princes or republics to their subjects to profess the religion they choose. It presumes the compatibility of each permitted religion with their civil society. Religious toleration is the permission given by Almighty God to profess any religion they please. Religious toleration leads to religious indifferentism, the belief that one religion is as good as another. Indifferentism, therefore, perpetuates lies and falsehoods. It establishes a religious pluralism through which people do not have the courage to differentiate right from wrong principles. Religious toleration is contrary to Catholicism because it is the one true church, and the existence of other religions is in some sense a spiritual scandal. But the Catholic Church is compatible with political toleration, so long as the state does not prohibit the church from fulfilling its spiritual end by preaching and evangelizing. Political toleration is, of course, compatible with the United States Constitution, which also respects the political toleration of Catholics. Even if Catholics were to become a majority religion, American principles, American constitutional principles, are so sound, according to Brownson, that they would not, quote, require any external changes in our existing political institutions, in our domestic and social economies, or in the present mutual relations of the civil and ecclesiastical powers, end quote. Brownson emphasizes that the church is compatible with every type of government, so long as that government is not despotical. Now, Brownson's allowance for political toleration is welcome to modern ears, but in advocating for it, he needs to address why the church did not always tolerate other religions in the public square. In a brief aside in his essay, Civil and Religious Toleration, Brownson does acknowledge that there could theoretically be a legitimate state that recognizes an established Catholic Church as the law of the land and could theoretically ban the toleration of other religions, because that was the historical reality in the medieval period. The aside shows that Brownson is not a religious liberty purist, insofar as he is willing to bow to old customs. However, he is not interested in talking about that possibility for two reasons. First, he notes that, quote, the social changes that have taken place in recent times, such states have lost their force and cannot now be urged for the establishment or the maintenance of similar governments, end quote. The unique political role that the church had during the Dark Ages was to ensure order in barbarous times. The fall of the Roman Empire left a power vacuum that the church filled. Its practice of punishing infidelity, heresy, and schism may have been appropriate for its time to establish order, but it is not a natural power the church has over the entirety of space and time. Brownson portrays the punishing of infidelity, heresy, and schism as justifiable in these regimes because they were crimes against the cohesiveness of society, not because they are sins. He even notes that if the world falls into barbarism, perhaps the church could yet again take on that political role. There isn't necessarily a progressive argument here, but he neither wishes for the collapse of civilization nor the return of the church's temporal power. Temporal power is best left to the state, and the states of Europe are civilized enough where the church can recede from its old temporal role. Secondly, and more tacitly, Brownson appears to not think that established religions are best or even desired, because he fears that the temporal power will overstep its power and jurisdiction. Therefore, the existence of confessional states in Catholic history does not mandate the existence or advocation of one in the United States. Rather, the United States is compatible with Brownson's preference for political toleration. Brownson is clear that his conception of spiritual and temporal power is not meant to create a theocracy. The clergy are supposed to have priestly and pastoral responsibilities as teachers, guardians, and judges of both natural and revealed law. They are to instruct the minds of the rich and the poor, the wise and the simple, the king and the subject. But they are not to administer the civil government, because it's not proper for them to do so. They are to ensure, without using explicitly political means, that the regime remains Christian. Additionally, Brownson notes that many regimes outside the United States do not respect religious liberty. Brownson, as we've seen, is a staunch defender of sovereignty, but he's deeply concerned about when sovereignty is used to infringe upon the rights of the church. He acknowledges that his 19th century contemporaries claim to defend religious liberty, but they often violate the religious liberty they claim. They have destroyed and weakened the established churches of Europe, but through excessive legislation they have tried to limit the church's exercise of power. Brownson acknowledges and argues that many formerly Catholic countries are more likely to violate religious liberty than the United States. So, for example, the United States doesn't have necessarily the political Gallicanism. It doesn't have the problem of having an oath of allegiance like the oath of allegiance of 1604, and that this allows Catholics to be able to act upon their faith while still remaining Americans in good standing. Fortunately, the United States policy of political toleration protects the Catholic Church more efficiently than the policies of old traditional Catholic states. Hence, Brownson believes that Catholicism can flourish in the United States. But the flourishing of Catholicism in our country, Brownson argues, will have to be voluntary, respective of individual free will, and not enforced by the temporal power. Brownson's view, therefore, is relatively optimistic, and the history of the United States has shown that his optimism has, I think, been somewhat justified. There will always be the possibility of a lurking tension between Catholicism and the United States, but it is up to the role of each generation to navigate any tensions with prudence and charity, loving simultaneously the Catholic Church and the United States. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thanks for your papers. Let's see if we can get you guys to fight. I don't know if we can. But actually, before we even get into that, I wanted to ask some kind of baseline questions in order to try to get at what Brownson's argument, the heart of Brownson's argument is, and try to distinguish it as well from some others that might be well known. So my first and very, I hope, kind of basic question, this is the lightning round part of the panel. What's a Concordat, and have we ever had one in the United States?
Concordat's just a treaty between the Holy See and a temporal government.
Yeah.
Regulating the life of I shouldn't say regulate. The goal is to get legal guarantees for the rights of the church in a particular country. And we would, haven't had one in the U.S., and I don't think we ever will, because that would be conceived as a recognition of,
Was there ever one attempted?
Goodness, I can't imagine. So, I mean, even getting an ambassador. Oh, really?
There was.
When? No, when?
Just after independence. So the story comes from, you might remember it when you hear it.
Yeah.
The story, I only know the story from John Courtney Murray. But in the middle of We Hold These Truths, it might even be the chapter on Articles of Peace. apparently the Bishop of Paris, who would have had jurisdiction over the colonies then, sent a letter. I think Thomas is remembering this story. Sent a letter and said, let's get a concordat going. Who do we talk to, basically? And the Second Continental Congress responded and said, not us.
Yeah.
We don't have any jurisdiction. Not implying, for example, that the states did or something like that, although arguably they would have had more possibility. But it's really from then on that there's no official kind of institutionalized relationship in any but kind of bare bones sort of way. So one of the things we've heard from you all and from other authors today, some of the other panelists today, is that Brownson takes historical developments and historical contingency seriously. So I suppose my question is, where do we locate Brownson's kind of considered judgment on what the best possible relationship is? Or does he just not think in those terms? But if he does, if you can imagine it, what's the best possible relationship between, for example, the church's hierarchy in the world and a particular government like the United States or unlike the United States?
Yeah, I mean, he says that American arrangements aren't perfect, but he never specifies what perfection would look like. And I think maybe he would say we can't specify it abstractly from concrete historical conditions. Yeah.
So I have maybe some more follow-up questions on John Courtney Murray, but the thing that occurs to me hearing you all rehearse some of Brownson's arguments is actually another guy that we think a lot of around here, which is Leo XIII, who seems to suggest in some of his writing on the United States that actually this is a really great way to do it. What would Brownson have made of Leo's, if you're familiar enough with
absolutely.
of Leo's arguments?
So I think he would have, so in Longinqua Oceanum, he says, the laws are great, the church in America is flourishing, but then he says, it would be even better if it was recognized.
Well, this is why I asked.
So that I think, it's hard to know what he would say, of course, because he died before that, but I think my guess is that he would have some reticence about affirming that, because if I were, again, trying to inhabit his mind, I think he would say that we can actually, I think in his view, American arrangements in some way transcend the kind of specific legal mechanisms or specific legislation that Leo seems to envision. And you see actually a very similar line of argument in John Ryan and in Murray, too. So I think there's real, whether it's direct continuity, they're certainly thinking in the same way. So I think his instinct would be to say, if we try to do that with specific laws, we'll mess it up.
Who's the we messing it up when you say that?
Well, Brownson in America, if the church tried to do that, I think he would find that counterproductive, even if it might theoretically be preferable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have something to add right now? Counter. All right, Thomas, you're on the hot seat.
All right.
I'm going to totally take one of your sentences out of context.
Mm-hmm.
But at one point, you said this sentence: the church trumps the state. You just left it at that. Now, of course, it's in a wider argument. But my question is, in what senses, in what circumstances is Brownson talking about the church trumping the state?
Sure. So let's say in 19th century Europe, there would have been certain states that would prohibit Catholics from attending church. And what you do in a situation where a Danish man can't lawfully go to church. And in that circumstance, a Catholic is not supposed to fall upon legal positivism. The Catholic is supposed to, in a nonviolent way, or continue to attend church. Brownson would not be against the foxholes of 16th century England, but I think throughout his writings there is a weariness, a skepticism of violent undertakings to overturn a regime because of his respect for sovereignty. And to one of your points, that's what makes particularities and particular historical circumstances so important to Brownson. So that there are times in which We are not to follow the law, but we have to not follow that law in the most responsible, charitable way possible.
Yeah. Okay. One of the interesting thoughts that this all spurs for me, actually, is knowing something about the history of colonial Maryland, for example. Maryland, which was ostensibly founded as a Catholic colony, and yet by the eve of the Revolution was had very little time for Catholic practice out in the world. You could have Catholic masses, but they had to be in your house, right? For example, Catholic schools were outlawed pretty much, such that even the Carroll family, if you're familiar, was not, at first for the kind of grammar school level, they were sending to a kind of secret Catholic school over on the Eastern Shore. And then by the time you got to the kind of high school age, they just shipped them off to Belgium, to where some exiled English Jesuits were running a famous school there. So I bring all of that up by way of suggesting that there is, in a way, at least some of the historical contingencies of the United States actually don't support some of what Brownson is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me actually that we have to put it on the table, and I'm just kind of throwing the gauntlet down. I want you guys to take it up. What do we do with the fact that there is a kind of history of anti-Catholicism in the United States?
Yeah. So he actually has an essay on this or dealing partly with this from, I think, the 1850s, where he's reviewing a book where somebody is claiming that American religious liberty comes from Maryland. And he actually says, this is one of the things I admire about him, is that he does not engage in pious falsehoods with regard to the founding. And so he says, no, this is completely not true because of all the reasons you just said. What there was instead was toleration, and even that was fraught. And I think this goes back to the, I think it's the line in the American public. He says they were guided by a reason more powerful than their own. Forget it, but it's basically they built better than they knew.
Yeah. Well, sounds familiar.
And
sounds like Courtney Murray.
I think I think his take is basically, yes, it's problematic at the beginning, but then it evolves into something that actually works pretty well.
Interestingly, the way that evolves.
Last thing would be, again, another part of his larger take on this is to say, no, the founding's not Catholic, and that's okay because it serves the common good, in spite of the fact that the theoretical principles indirectly behind it are not correct. But sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the reasons that the founding ended up not being, I suppose, Catholic, of course, but neither did it end up being anti-Catholic, was because there were certain Catholics involved at the time in a way that they weren't in the colonial period, right? There were kind of increasing population numbers of Catholics. At least some authors say that it's really the combined work of Charles and John Carroll that help, among other things, design the kind of religious liberty arguments on the eve of the Revolution and other things. And of course, Charles especially was in the kind of refounding of Maryland around the time of independence, responsible for that, and a lot of other things. But, okay. Well, if Thomas, you made a distinction between religious toleration and political toleration.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, because I had some questions on that too.
Sure. So Brownson in this essay argues that the danger of religious toleration would be not making judgment upon the truth of a particular religion. The danger of that is that it perpetuates falsehoods. It perpetuates lies, because it would essentially be making the argument that one religion is as good as another. And so when we are, as Catholics, we would have a responsibility to say in our interactions, when appropriate, the Catholic Church is the true church. It's one holy, Catholic, and apostolic. And that is protected to us through the First Amendment. Catholics cannot believe in religious toleration because religious toleration is it's a social toleration. But politically, the political toleration Brownson does not find any problems with the First Amendment. Now, of course, this is the First Amendment prior to the 14th Amendment, and so perhaps I'm imposing some modern incorporation theory when I say the First Amendment. But Brownson is not politically scandalized by the existence of Unitarians in the United States.
He was one at one point, right?
He certainly was one. And of course, in his writings, he goes after Unitarians. He goes after Protestants in almost every other one of his essays. But Brownson acknowledges, at least through our Constitution, the political right of Protestants to worship and to engage in politics. And that would be political toleration, and that is legitimate.
What I wonder, well, maybe I'll leave that by the wayside. One of the things I'm groping for in listening to you two is some sort of image or picture or continuum on which to situate a lot of the different terms that we've put on the table today. So I'm just going to read some of them, and I wonder if you could say, well, this is in the middle and this is okay. Well, one of the things that we've heard a number of times, and I think it makes all the sense in the world on this panel to talk about, is integralism. And we've heard some kind of overt and less overt references to that. There was some reference to the kind of Hobbesian way of conceiving of some of these things as well. Gallicanism was mentioned. And then, of course, there's a kind of American separationism, if we want to call it that. I don't know what our shorthand should be. It's tempting always. I mean, anybody who's formed by Aristotle is you always want to say, well, there's this extreme, and then the other extreme, and then there's the third one right in the middle or something. How can we situate some of these terms against each other just so we understand what might be unique about Brownson's insights on these matters?
So I would say in terms of ecclesiology, Brownson is a strong ultramontanist, right? So he definitely has that in common with integralism as I understand it. I think a lot of the theoretical critique actually can be shared in common. Part of the big difference is that Brownson, I think, has like more than a half full glass, view of America, right? In the sense of, yes, there are these problems with, the theoretical underpinnings of the founding, and yes, it's a Protestant culture and so on. But it's actually, if you detach yourself from this and kind of look at the way it works, it actually works quite well. And so again, we can have a half full glass view or more than half a full glass view. Yeah.
So I think the problem with integralism is it's a very broad tent, and one integralist doesn't necessarily share the same presuppositions as another one, because there are some integralists who are actively drawing upon the Aristotelian Thomistic vocabulary, and they might even approach something akin to Brownson because they're using that vocabulary. But then there is a wing of the integralist movement that is more enamored by modern politics, enamoration or support for Franco, Salazar, and others. And I think, not to get into a rabbit hole, I'm not convinced that the Salazar-Franco model of governance is the same thing as that Aristotelian Thomistic framework, and that the more modern influences of integralism might be influenced by guys like Carl Schmitt and then Hobbes through that.
Yeah.
And that second, more modern aspect of integralism, I think, is not compatible with Brownson.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to add to that briefly, I think Brownson is really strongly, in all this stuff that I was talking about, he's strongly influenced by early modern neo-scholasticism. And so again, there's strands of integralism that also grow out of that.
Who would he have in mind when he...
Well, like Bellarmine, Suarez.
Yeah, okay.
And Hobbes has that very famous chapter in the Leviathan where his main target is Bellarmine.
Yeah.
And I think those integralists of that modern persuasion would benefit from reading Hobbes's criticism of Bellarmine,
Right.
because we see the tension between certain modern concepts of sovereignty with Bellarmine's defense of the two swords.
So that brings me to hopefully my last question, because I want to get the audience involved as well. In what sense is Brownson a modern thinker, and in what sense is he not on these questions?
I think the most modern aspect of Brownson is he is a quintessentially American thinker. So he is, in defending political toleration, he's defending something that Bellarmine does not do in his treatise. So that is either, depending upon your view, a development or not. I do think it is a development. That is, I think, the most striking aspect of it. And then Brownson has a more historical mindset than perhaps some of the 17th and 18th century social contract theories, perhaps more of a historical mindset than even some of the ancients. Where he gets his views on history, I have not been able to nail down. It's not Hegelian. Of course, he's an interlocutor with Cardinal Newman and with Lord Acton, but there is a historicity without being a historicist. And I think that is something that is somewhat new compared to that Aristotelian Thomistic strand.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I would just add that, and look, he in several places when he's commenting on events in France, and they were called integralists back then, but 19th century, French Catholic monarchists, he's saying, look, I don't disagree with these guys in principle. I just don't think this is a viable model for politics going forward. And so he's willing to say we can't just go back to the way things were before 1789. We're evolving toward, again, based on a historical but not historicist understanding of history. We're evolving towards something where we're going to need different institutions.
What questions might we have from you all? Yeah, please.
So you talked a little bit about Brownson's thoughts about theocracy along with integralism, and I don't know if this was a product of the time you have for the essay, but it seemed like there's a possibility that he's kind of conflating the ideas. I was wondering if you think that that's something. It's kind of a two-part question, because I want to know if it seems like he conflates theocracy with all forms of integralism.
His definition of theocracy can be quite broad, because I think, to be honest, if we were to ask 10 people what a definition of theocracy is, we get 5 different answers. But at the very least, when he's condemning theocracy, he's condemning very clearly an ecclesiastical member of holding political office. He does not want Cardinal Richelieu to be Secretary of State. I don't think any of us want Richelieu to be Secretary of State.
Yeah, so I think that is widely shared. I mean, like, by integralists today, I don't think most people want a theocracy where the clergy are also the political leaders. I think that's the common position, has been for a very long time. So I was wondering then if his opposition to integralism is more based on this premise about clergy, or if it's more based on this idea that the state shouldn't be adopting the church's laws as their own laws. Because this is a little bit of a different statement, right? Like saying the Pope should rule the kingdom and the kingdom should adopt the laws of the church are different statements, right?
So different things are learned through different laws. Natural law, natural reason, I do think takes us pretty far. Natural reason bans murder, theft, sexual deviancy. Natural law would ban Mormon polygamy. And things like that without any explicit invocation of the Bible. And that's the Thomistic strand of his thinking, where reason goes pretty far. And despite his criticism of Protestant private judgment, despite his criticism of individual appeals to conscience that are not ingrained by the church, Brownson Brownson does believe that there are many remarkable aspects of the American constitutional order, that the natural law is still present in certain Protestant strands. What I think he would ban is anything, or not ban, but he wouldn't want a government to enforce anything that is known through revelation. That is his interpretation of the separation between temporal and spiritual power. And I should add that when we talk of the two swords theory, there might be some differences among its advocates of its jurisdiction. Bellarmine and Suarez probably have certain differences from Brownson.
No, it's great.
Yeah. You mentioned, one of you mentioned John Courtney Murray. Do we have any solid evidence that Brownson influenced John Courtney Murray on this whole question of religious toleration, or political toleration among religions? Do we have any information on this?
No, that's a great question, and the answer is no. So I cannot find a single reference to Brownson. I'd read almost everything Murray published, and there is not one reference to Brownson. The only thing that suggests he might have been familiar with him, and this is, I haven't been in like the archives or anything.
Right, I understand.
But Theological Studies published an essay on Brownson while Murray was on the editorial staff. So he probably read that essay, and that's like 1954, I think. But there's just not a single direct reference, and it's striking because they both have a strong sense of historical contingency. They both have a pretty similar view of kind of the church and state as being parallel, perfect societies and everything. One difference would be that Murray is not as strong an ultramontanist in his ecclesiology at all, really, as Brownson was. And also Murray expressly rejects the indirect power of the popes, whereas Brownson doesn't specifically use the term, but substantially that's what he is describing. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Yeah.
Maybe one more.
So if he's rejecting this sort of integralism, does he make an attempt to square this with papal documents from the 14th and 15th century? Does he have like a serious strain of thought where he goes over these things and says, how can my thinking about the American Constitution be squared with something like unum sanctum, things like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is, this is either in an 1854 essay. It's the last essay in volume 4 of the collected works of the political ideas, or it's in the last chapter in the American Republic on the origins of government, where he does argue that those passages and made by those popes are of a particular error and are not applicable to Americans in the 19th century.
Well, maybe in the interest of catching back up, we should call it for this panel. Yeah, but join me in thanking our panelists.